The fact that there's a rich guy somewhere is neither here nor there when it comes to, okay, here's a poor person over here. What you want to know is, okay, how do people get out of poverty? What you want is a system in which people can, by working, work themselves out of poverty and create wealth for themselves and others. And when that's happening sort of system-wide, what you have is that people can buy more and more of those basic things that they need with less and less work, so that the time value that's expended, say, on food or on shelter, it goes down so that they can focus more of their energy on other things.
Welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Myers. This is a production of Summit Ministries, and I want to, before we dig into the content of the show, let you know that I would like for you, as a podcast friend, to have a free copy of my new book called Should Christians Support Israel? Seeking a Biblical Worldview in an Impossible Situation. This doesn't relate to today's topic. I just want you to know that it's available because the book shows how, on especially difficult issues like the Israel-Palestine conflict, to develop a biblical worldview and help people be de-radicalized, overcome the indoctrination that they're getting in the popular culture. Again, if you want that, just go to summit.org/Israel and you can get your copy and find out how to get more copies to distribute to your friends, family, church, others who are concerned about the issue, organizations, all different kinds of places that you might want to use it. But it's called Should Christians Support Israel? You can get it at summit.org/Israel. It's my gift for my podcast buddies. Well, let's talk about today's show. You know what the Bible says about the battles we face today? It says that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and evil spiritual forces. So what does it look like for Christians to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves as we fight this good fight of faith? Are we to just sit back passively, or should we engage? And how do we engage in a loving way? Well, welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. This is where we explore questions like that. We look at where God is at work, changing everything through Jesus. And today, we're going to discuss how the truth changes everything about how we wisely engage the culture. My guest today is Dr. Jay Richards. Jay is the director of the DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family at the Heritage Foundation. He's a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute and executive editor of The Stream. Jay is the author or editor of more than a dozen books. He's appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs, and his latest book is called Fight the Good Fight: How an Alliance of Faith and Reason Can Win the Culture War. We're going to dig into some of the tough topics, talk about the things that, frankly, don't often get talked about in church, and see if there's a biblical worldview of those issues. So please welcome Dr. Jay Richards to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. Dr. Jay Richards, welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Good to be with you.
It's good to be with you as well. We've done at least one show together before. I think we did one on transgender last year, and we were focused on that with the book, Exposing the Gender Lie. And thank you for all of your work on that issue.
Sure.
This time, I really want to dig into your new book, Fight the Good Fight, because you're proposing an alliance between faith and reason that can help Christians, I think, and this is our primary audience, grapple with what do you do in politics to be a good citizen, but to not sell your soul in the process.
Yes. That's the dilemma. And the other dilemma is whether we like it or not. I mean, I said, look, okay, let's say we take all the socially conservative Catholics, evangelicals, and Jews in the United States. That's not 51% of the population, whether we like it or not. We'd love to talk about the silent majority, but we got to face the facts that, we live in a very fractured and diverse country. So that could be sort of depressing. That's the bad news. The good news is that what I'll just call the kind of rabid secular left has gotten so rabid and so contrary to common sense that there are new coalitions forming. I mean, I certainly see this on the gender ideology issue where I work on more or less full time now at the Heritage Foundation. situation in which you have the same kinds of people that you would see at the March for Life, but you also have left of center atheist evolutionary biologists and radical feminists who identify as lesbian and all sorts of people that were not working together a few years ago, but that say, oh, this idea that male and female, that's not a real thing. That's crazy. And so when you have something like that, I think in the sort of public sphere, there is an opportunity for new coalitions. And so we wrote, James Robinson and I wrote this book, Fight the Good Fight, primarily to say, okay, how should we think about all these sort of policy issues as Christians, but also how do we make common cause and arguments and persuasive arguments, especially for people like that don't otherwise share our theological beliefs?
I think that's great. Let's walk through it a little bit, just some blocking and tackling here. What are some of the key ideologies that are at play, especially as we're looking at this particular political moment?
Well, this moment, don't think of the fight of 2024 as if this is, say, the Cold War of 1980, in which you have the free world and maybe the UK and the United States fighting against a global Marxist power like the Soviet Union. It's much, much more complicated. In the United States, what we have is kind of, to speak simplistically, a kind of cultural Marxism, not the kind of hard economic Marxism where you collectivize all the farms and the factories, but a cultural Marxism that just sees absolutely every social relation in terms of a conflict between an oppressor and an oppressed. And so Marx had that, right? The workers versus the owners. But it can be a conflict of males or females, white, black, global north versus global south, gay versus straight. You can see how this goes, right? Just explain everything in terms of conflict, amplify the conflict, hope that leads to a dissolution of the current order, and then you can replace it with whatever your utopian dream is. That's the ideology that has worked its way basically through all of our major institutions, through the commanding heights of culture. And that's what we've got to deal with internally. That is the kind of internal rot. Externally, I honestly think it's actually a much more assertive China that is our greatest threat, at least on the global stage. They're not Marxist in the same way that the Soviet Union were. They're more like a kind of left-wing fascism in which you have a kind of private sector that's fused with the public sector in the state. And so it's much more complicated. But frankly, China is just a much more economically robust country than the Soviet Union ever was. And so we're dealing with something in which we have external threats, but we also have internal threats. And honestly, if I were to say which one is more dangerous to us, I actually think it's the internal threats, unfortunately.
Jay, where did that come from? It's always helpful for me to do a little bit of a diagnostic. How did we get to the place where people really do believe the world is as simple as the oppressor versus the oppressed?
Well, a lot of it, the only way I could describe it is a kind of infiltration of the influential institutions. It started, people have heard of critical theory and these things. I mean, that was actually a group of thinkers, the Frankfurt School, that left Europe around the time of World War II, settled in the United States, and helped to introduce this kind of radical critical theory, which is a type of cultural Marxism, into the American academy. It worked its way into education schools so that almost every teacher that goes to an educational school in this country is going to be exposed to these ideas, and they teach them in kind of a dumbed down vernacular version to school kids. And so you don't have to capture the hearts and minds of everyone. You just capture the institutions that ultimately influence and teach people. And that's essentially what's happened. So that it seems strange, but the left recognized the power of cultural institutions, and they didn't just think of the media. They didn't just think of the higher education. They thought of the National Football League. They thought of all the C-suites of the Fortune 500 companies. They understood that all of these play a role in shaping our worldview and our culture, and they set about to infiltrate these institutions. And frankly, I think they did a really good job. There's a part of me that almost admires the cleverness of doing this, but I think that they had to do it by subterfuge, because the reality is that most people don't actually see the world that way. Jeff, honestly, I don't think most people see the world, for instance, in terms of a racial conflict. I mean, we look every night on the news, there's some kind of racial conflict in which they're trying to stir that up in us. But I can tell you for 20 years, I've almost every night worked out in a gym, which was very multi-ethnic. There are many gyms or nights where I'd be the only white guy in the place. I've never never seen a racial incident at all in 20 years, and that can't just be completely unusual. And so I constantly remind myself that what the sort of powers that be want is for us to be at each other's throats. They want to divide us. And we've got to speak the truth, even when it's divisive, but we can't fall for these kinds of campaigns that are really designed to dissolve what it is that we love about this country.
I think that's really insightful, and I just want to highlight it. I'm thinking back to when I first learned about Marxism, learning about the Hegelian dialectic, that history advances through conflict.
Yes.
So the goal is not unity.
No.
So in a church, you might think, oh, well, if we have people of different races and we have tension, then we got to figure out how to have unity. You know, I'm a married guy.
Yeah.
I want to have unity with my wife. We know that it's not easy. We have to work for it.
That's exactly right.
We think that unity is the goal. But what you're talking about here, this needs to be underscored. The forces that you are talking about are not interested in unity. They only believe that history can advance when we have conflict.
That is absolutely right. And I'll give you one final example of that, queer theory, that's not a pejorative. That's an actual division, right? It's one of these critical theories called self-identified as queer theory. And if you read the queer theorists, what they will tell you is that the purpose of queer theory is to decenter and destabilize our categories of reality. So not just the kind of economic relations, but the very concepts we use to understand reality, like, say, boy and girl or male and female. That's what they want to do. They're quite explicit about it, and they think that's kind of the only way that we can get to the promised land of their imaginings.
How much do you think... I mean, it seems like that's succeeding. You and through social media, it's very easy to monetize conflict.
Yeah.
So you end up with the right versus the left. And I work with a lot of young adults. I see a lot of discouragement among those among those in that generation. They look at this and say, well, people on the left are saying America's bad. People on the right are saying America's stupid or whatever. Maybe America's just become a force for the bad things in the world rather than a force for the good things. You know, only 16% of Gen Z will say that they are proud to live in the United States, as opposed to 70% of those who are in my generation.
Yeah, and same. I'm a Gen Xer, and so it's a completely different experience. I do think that mostly reflects, honestly, their social media habits and the things that they were taught in schools. If you've been taught that basically America is a force for evil in the world for a couple of decades, how are you going to believe otherwise? When people do tell me that, though, I ask them, have you ever visited any other countries? Have you ever been to Latin America? Have you ever been to Asia? Have you ever been to Europe? Right? Look, I was in the UK, and I'm an Anglophile, if anything, a few weeks ago. I'm telling you, there's a lot of bad stuff happening in other countries too. In fact, what's happening here is a manifestation of what's happening globally. This is effectively a global movement, and it's absolutely terrible, but at least there's a fight here. I mean, some places have just surrendered completely to these forces. The U.S. still has a federated system in which some states there's still some life left, and so I think we need to be optimistic that, look, the body's not dead yet, but it probably needs to be resuscitated.
Yeah, man, that's a good way to put it. Well, if you get 50 experiments on something, hopefully some of them will turn out okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's develop a biblical framework here, because that's what you and James do and Fight the Good Fight. And I mean, you guys you've done another book several years ago. You did another book together, and you're coming from two very different positions, both Christians, but both from a different Christian tradition.
Yeah.
And yet the way you come together and write about this, I think it can be really unifying. So kind of build that out a little bit. What is a biblical framework for thinking about the cultural issues that are going to be involved in our political decision making?
Well, the reality is what we want to say is we were talking about unity a minute ago. And if Christians are going to actually have an effect in the public square, in politics in particular, we've got to figure out how to work together. And so that means finding those things that we share in common and not fixating on the things on which we disagree. I mean, there's this, I think it's a quote from Freud, but it's this idea of narcissism of small differences. And so it's basically the 4.5-point Calvinist spends all of his energy fighting the 5-point Calvinists, right? That's the dilemma that we often have. And look, this happens in academia too. The right is really good at arguing on these sorts of things. And so we try to say, look, here's these fundamental truths on which Christians and Christians and Jews agree on. We believe that there's a God. We believe that there is a natural moral order that God has built into things. We believe God has revealed himself, so there's special revelation. And we believe that the universe and the physical universe as a whole actually testifies to its existence, so that God reveals himself specially and generally as creator. That's what the American founders thought too. However sort of heterodox some of them may have been, that's the thing we've lost. So that now if you talk about a natural moral law, or you just talk about the existence of a creator, you're being sectarian. You're being a Christian nationalist. Well, that Thomas Jefferson thought you could know that God existed by reason alone. That's actually a long-standing view in the Christian tradition. So a lot of what we initially try to do is just kind of resuscitate that basic idea. So as Christians, that means you can make public arguments on moral grounds appealing to the natural law. You can also appeal to biblical texts. You sort of have to use your judgment as to where one is more effective than the other. But then once we do that, this is what we talk about, this alliance of faith and reason. Don't imagine that all you have is the explicit text of Scripture. You also have God's world that he has created and that testifies to moral truths. That's the thing that, it takes a while to kind of get that in your head so you know how to make those arguments. So we try to model it from everything from the church-state question to the size of government, to trade, the gender issue, marriage, life, family, all these things, just kind of over and over. How do you make these arguments? How do we think of it as Christians? How do you make a public argument designed to conjugate rather than to divide?
I think it was Ronald Reagan who talked about not forsaking your 80% friends because of the 20%.
That's right.
There's a lot of wisdom in that. And it is very difficult. There are stark examples in history. We were just talking about, we've been talking about Israel a lot at Summit Ministries this summer. And when you look back at AD 70, when Jerusalem fell, it didn't fall because the Roman army was so powerful. Yeah. Jerusalem was well supplied, well defended. It fell because there were 3 factions that developed inside the city of Jerusalem that attacked one another and burned one another's food supplies.
That's right.
Weakening it to the point where the Roman army could come in and take over. It was infighting that led to the defeat.
Absolutely. And you can look at Christian history in the same way. I mean, there was the Great Schism of 1054 that sort of was, overlaid on the way that the Roman Empire had collapsed. It was those divisions that sort of predated 1054 by several centuries that I'm convinced actually led to the rise of Islam, which basically occupied previously Christian territories. And then you've got the split starting at the Protestant Reformation in the West. And all of these, I think in some ways, we need to look at what's happening in the world, not just as what bad people are doing to us, but as God's punishment and judgment on the church for not doing what he called us to do in John 17. That doesn't mean, we just surrender to it, but let's kind of face facts here, that if Christians were unified and were, a body of Christ is sort of visibly manifest, the culture would be radically different than it actually is.
Wow. Well, let's apply that. Let's see if we can dig into some of the big issues and talk about where the consensus might be. Why don't we start with, because I know you focused a lot on economics, why don't we start with the size of government? Yeah. At Summit, we teach about sphere sovereignty. You've got the family, the church, and the state. And if we think of them as 3 balloons in a box. If any one balloon gets blown up bigger, then the other 2 get squeezed. When I ask the students, which of the 3 balloons do you think has blown up bigger today? They all say the state, the government. Yeah. They all agree. 55% of people in America say the government is too big. Only 7% say it's too small. And yet the 7% seem to be winning the day. Can you kind of make a case for why we should not think of government as the solution to all of our problems? Why a right-sized government rather than an overwhelmingly intrusive government that's involved in every aspect of life is a better way from this biblical framework?
I mean, I really like the way you put it, Jeff, that there are God-given spheres and domains in which certain institutions have competence. And what you want in a healthy society is for the institutions with the competence to be in charge, right? There's another principle called the principle of subsidiarity, that you want the jurisdiction at the lowest level that's competent to handle a problem. That's why you want parents who are the two people that love this child most in the world, all things being equal, to be the ones that make decisions about when the child goes to sleep and when you go to the doctor and all those kinds of things. It's not because someone at the Department of Health and Human Services is uncaring. It's because they don't know anything about that child. They have to treat everyone sort of generically because of their distance. What happens when the government grows? What's the government's kind of core competence? I'd say government, the intrinsic logic of the state is force. It's coercion. Now, it's not always hard force. It might be fining. It might be just kind of some pressure, but ultimately it's about coercion. That's different from an educational environment or a voluntary organization or a family or a business. And so if you think of it that way, okay, well, the government has to do something. So sometimes force is appropriate. But when we're saying, should government be involved in this? What we're really saying is it appropriate that people get coerced to do the right thing here or not? And if you think of it that way, it seems fairly obvious. Okay, when we're dealing with coercion, we should try to keep that to a minimum, right? Only where absolutely necessary. And the larger the government gets, the more of the kind of its coercive power, it occupies the jurisdiction of those other institutions. It's not just government versus individuals. It's government, individuals, churches, businesses, marketplaces, voluntary organizations, on and on and on and on. Those are all institutions too. And they all either get shrunk or they get assimilated to the government when the government metastasizes and grows too big. And I mean, I'm here in Washington, D.C. I'm literally 300 yards from the U.S. Capitol. I am acutely aware of these massive administrative agencies that control almost every aspect of our lives. And a lot of it happens without people, ordinary Americans even really realizing that it's happening. But it absolutely is. The government is absolutely metastatic. It is metastasized into every corner, every nook and cranny of our lives. And we got to figure out a way to shrink it. The reason that doesn't happen, as you said, there's like 7% seem to want this and it happens, is because the natural incentives are for government always to grow and never to shrink. And so it really requires a concerted effort and campaign and committed people to actually pare it back.
A lot of my students at Summit Ministries are asking questions about this. And some of them are wondering, why is it that when we talk to our friends who think there should be a government program for this or that, when we say we don't think there should be, they don't just treat that as a counter argument. They treat that as a moral failure if you fail to believe that. Why is that? And I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what you...
I think it's because of a prior mentality, which is that there are only two possibilities. There's either the individual on his own against the world, right? This isolated, autonomous monad of an individual, or there's the government, which helps us, right? And so if the government, there's a problem out here with this person, and if the government isn't going to be involved, then what we're saying is that person should just die, right? Which is, of course, absolutely not what certainly any Christian or serious person is arguing. It's that you want to say, okay, if this is a social problem or an individual problem, what's the best way to solve it? What's the best way to address it? And by best, I mean most likely to help and least likely to hurt in terms of costs and benefits. That's the kind of basic economic question that most people don't ever ask. They just say, oh, you want to raise the minimum wage to $100 an hour? Oh, you want to put price controls on fast food or on groceries? That's great. Then they'll keep the prices down. What we have to learn to say is, okay, that sounds nice, but what would actually happen if we say fix prices for groceries below the market price? We actually know the answer to that question. Any knowledge of economics knows the answer, but we don't do that because we get carried away with the kind of good intentions of the person we presume that's proposing the idea.
Yeah, I do want to talk about price controls a little bit more because that has come up.
Yes.
In the presidential campaign that is underway as we are recording this. But I wanted to just highlight something you mentioned. The primary power of government is force. It's the primary thing it can offer. And that means that if the government gives anything to anybody, it hasn't created that value.
No.
It is only giving to one person what it has taken from someone else.
That's right.
So somebody there is making a value decision about which people's interests should be elevated and which people's interests should be suppressed.
That's right. That's exactly right. And this is always the danger when the government then treats us in different ways based on our age or our race or anything like that. Insofar as it's possible, we want the government to act justly. So that, in other words, before the government, we're all equal. In its eyes, the government's going to it has to fund itself somehow. So it's going to have to have taxes. It has to have revenue, but it needs to do it in a way that is most likely to help the flourishing of the society and least likely to harm it. Unfortunately, that's very often not the case.
If you were to sit down over coffee with somebody and they said, well, why do you object to the idea that government programs ought to be the default solution? I mean, after all, they would look back and say, well, FDR, the Great Depression, the way he did that. I lived in Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Private companies would not have been able to do that. The federal government had to step in and do it. Help walk us through what that conversation would be like.
Well, and so some of those things are so far off that most, Social Security and Medicare, I mean, you get something back in the 1930s with these programs. So people don't really have a sense of how they are set up. I do tell people that the way Social Security works is it is basically a kind of pay-as-you-go system. It's not a pension plan. So when it started, there were 43 workers paying in for every worker that was receiving, because retirement age was very close to actually the life expectancy at the time. We're now about 2.5 workers paying in for every worker that's receiving. The country lives longer, so longer retirement age. We're having fewer children. So the thing's actually it's going to be insolvent here probably in 10 or 15 years. So that's just the kind of reality of that, is that it's borrowing from the future to pay current recipients. But let's take something like the means-tested welfare programs, most of which started with LBJ's War on Poverty in the mid-1960s. The purpose of it was to abolish poverty in the United States. And no one can deny that that is a noble enterprise. The only question is, okay, how best do you do that? If people are poor, what's the normal way in the universe that people get unpoor? It's nothing like a means-tested welfare program. What we have now, Jeff, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 70 and 80 different means-tested welfare programs. It's a massive amount of money. It may be $1 trillion a year. And if you look at poverty rates, starting in 1965, they were consistently going down until these programs started. And they've more or less stayed in the kind of same range, adjusted for inflation, ever since then. But what we have now is we have generational poverty, because what we have is a system that encourages people to have children out of wedlock and then actually punishes them if they get married. I mean, it's an absolutely crazy thing. Nobody would have thought that's a good idea when it started. That's where it ended up. The reason it ended up there is because we didn't think through the incentives that these kinds of programs were going to establish and think, oh, if that's going to happen, maybe there would have been a better way to deal with poverty than this system.
And the important thing to understand about those means-tested programs, and I don't think a lot of people realize, is that the federal government generally doesn't look at what absolute poverty is.
Oh, no,
they look
not
at
all.
Poverty relative to some kind of a standard that they set up as representing
That's
wealth.
right.
So if you make $100,000 a year, you might be thinking you're doing really well. If you turn around and find out other people are making $1 million a year, then you're poor.
Yeah, that's right. It's always going to be a relative poverty measure, because absolute poverty is these really basic things, like not enough calories to survive, not enough nutrients to keep from getting sick, no safety from the elements, those kinds of things. We've solved that kind of absolute poverty problem. And so now what we're dealing with is a kind of relative poverty problem in which no one, unless they just decide to do so, is going to starve to death. But people can get stuck in these cultural cycles for generations of poverty. And that's the creation of a means-tested welfare program. It's not something that would sort of naturally exist.
So people, we would not even look necessarily at wages. If we're going to look at this from a biblical worldview, we'd look at what people are able to purchase that they need and how much time it would take them to earn the money to purchase those things.
Exactly.
And if you look from that perspective, you're going to end up in a very different place from, this idea that the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. As an example, that's the rhetoric that you often hear.
It is, and the idea of the gap, that only makes sense. It's only a problem if the people that are rich because they stole it from other people, right? So that there's a kind of causal relation. The fact that there's a rich guy somewhere is neither here nor there when it comes to, okay, here's a poor person over here. What you want to know is, okay, how do people get out of poverty? What you want is a system in which people can, by working, work themselves out of poverty and create wealth for themselves and others. And when that's happening sort of system-wide, what you have is that people can buy more and more of those basic things that they need with less and less work, so that the time value that's expended, say, on food or on shelter, it goes down so that they can focus more of their energy on other things. That's what prosperity is. That's what we should want. We're not going to get the kingdom of God short of God establishing it, but we can certainly improve people's lives and conditions, and we know that. The only question is, what's the set of institutions and laws and incentives that are most conducive to that? And unfortunately, we don't often ask that question at a policy level and vote for people that actually advocate the stuff that's likely to help.
Yeah, well said. Let's you mentioned this a little bit earlier, so let's circle back to it about price controls. Yes. One of the presidential candidates recently announced that the solution to groceries and gas being more expensive is for the government to get involved and essentially determine what the prices of those things would be so it can drive the prices down. Yes. So you've written a lot on economics. Your book, Money, Greed, and God, is a bestseller. Help us through from a biblical framework and a rational framework, what kind of idea that is.
And this one is super simple. I mean, because this one directly violates like lessons 1, 2, and 3 of any microeconomics classes. And so just think about this. Can the government determine how much it costs for say, Kroger to get a head of romaine lettuce to a store? No, of course not. That has costs. That's going to be some kind of cost. The best that a company can do is try to reduce the costs, increase the quality, and then you're going to have grocery stores competing with each other. And so in a normal competitive environment, what a price is it's just a piece of information that tells you the underlying supply and demand of that thing. So it's a little packet of information, right? So if let's say it costs Kroger, 40 cents, to get a head of romaine lettuce, but then the government says they're only allowed to charge 30 cents for it. Well, that price control is going to do is it's going to create a shortage of the very thing that you're trying to control the prices for, because it won't be economical for anyone to supply it for you. It's the same thing whether it's food or it's gas or it's rental housing. This is one of these things on which economists across the spectrum almost universally agree on, is that when you try to fix the price of something below its natural market price, you're not going to keep the price on that thing down. You're just going to create massive shortages in that thing. Everybody knows this. It's so common. I think it was today I saw that some left-wing writer, I think in The Atlantic, said, sometimes we should just ignore economists. They never say that except in this case, because economists will say, you're not going to make these things more abundant by fixing the prices. You're just going to create shortages. Here's the reason that politicians will promise this, though, is that they're counting on their base not to understand the most rudimentary aspects of economics. So they're counting on their ability to fool you. Look, the politicians, none of them are so frankly stupid that they don't know this, but they also suspect that, well, if 60% of my base thinks this is a good idea, then I can promise it and they'll vote for me, which is the main incentive of a politician during an election year, is to get elected. So it helps to kind of always remind yourself of that.
Yes. And the rhetoric is one thing. I just worry that, a candidate like that would actually follow through on it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We don't want our grocery store shelves to look like the grocery store shelves in Venezuela.
No, that's right. And so what actually happens? I mean, so for instance, a politician might propose a minimum wage of $15 an hour, for instance, which was really popular for a while. You'll never hear them proposing a minimum wage of $200 an hour. And the reason is that they're hoping that, okay, they can kind of get the electoral boost of promising something, but it will not be so damaging that it's obvious what they've done. So that's what I would expect, is price controls that have so many complicated exceptions that they would hope that people would never connect the fact that the stores are empty with the politicians' policy. And remember that, because the politicians, they're not all going to do what Lenin did, right? After the Bolsheviks won the war in Russia in 1917, they collectivized all the farms, and millions of people die of starvation, right? That's kind of obviously a bad idea. And so politicians are going to try to do these things, but they're also going to try to disguise it so you can't quite tell what the effects are. That's what I would expect. I wouldn't expect just completely insane price controls. I would expect just constant tampering and tinkering with the system in a way that will increase their control, but without actually being obvious what a disaster it is.
Okay, back to the coffee situation. So if you're sitting across from someone and they say, but the groceries are too expensive, and I think they're too expensive because these companies are gouging us. Yeah. How do you respond to that?
I would say, well, why don't we get online and look at what their profit margins are? Because the assumption would be that the reason the prices are high is because in this case, the grocers are charging too much. That's the idea of price gouging, would just be that they're taking advantage of us and charging too much. Well, so how would that happen, right? So Kroger might try to charge too much, but what about Safeway across the street? And unless they're colluding, which is illegal, they're going to try to undercut Kroger. So even if they wanted to overcharge you, right, they're going to be in competition. Moreover, if you look, it's simply not true that, okay, during times of inflation, grocery stores suddenly are just flush with profits. It's absolutely not true. In fact, grocery stores and grocery chains, they very small margins actually in terms of profit. And so it's the kind of most simplistic thinking that economics is really, when it's doing its job, is designed to get you not to think this way. That, look, everything bad that happens in the economy isn't because somebody intended to do something bad for you. And that's the sort of assumption. We know what causes inflation. It's the government inflating the money supply so that there's more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services. That devalues each dollar that's floating around. That's what inflation is. It's not one grocery store chain deciding they're going to try to charge more than they can get away with, because they can't get away with it because they've got competition. And so it doesn't, even sort of 2 minutes of kind of walking through the scenario, I think, is in many cases enough to say, okay, yeah, I guess it doesn't make sense that maybe all the grocers just suddenly got greedy just right now, you know? I mean, that's what we'd be expected to believe. And so it's sort of what Thomas Sowell calls kind of level one thinking, right? It only kind of makes sense as long as you don't spend any time reflecting on it.
Yeah, that's good. Well, let's tackle one more that I know is a big issue dividing a lot of Christians, and kind of bring this into this faith and reason framework. And that is the issue of immigration.
Yep.
So illegal immigration has been a major issue for as long as I've been alive.
Yeah.
It's been a problem. It's accelerated. The implications specifically for cities in this country is unreal.
Absolutely.
Walk through, how do you make a wise decision on that?
Well, you got to first get clear on, okay, what are the sort of principles? Do countries have a right to have borders or not? And it's very similar to, do you as a homeowner have a right to borders? Or do you have a right not to just let anybody come in and camp out in your house, right? Now, of course, you're supposed to be hospitable, but nobody thinks that hospitality means just letting anyone that wants to come in and, set up camp in your young daughter's bedroom or something like that. Well, the same thing, look, if you are going to have a country is a geographical entity, it's going to have borders somewhere in which you decide who can come in and who can come out. We're not even doing that. That's kind of a basic precondition of a country, is that you are able to enforce your borders. Almost every other country does. In fact, all of the countries generally to our the south of our border do that. We don't do that, and we don't do it as a matter of policy. And I think finally in the last 4 years, it's become obvious that this is a choice. We're perfectly capable of keeping people from illegally crossing the border, but because both certain business interests and in particular certain political interests favor this, we've got it. And so that is what's happened. Now, Christians, it's very easy for Christians to have our compassion weaponized against us because we think of people that are maybe fleeing dangerous, sort of life-risking circumstances in Venezuela or North Korea or something like that. Absolutely true. We should do what we can realistically with people that are in a situation like that. You know what doesn't serve those interests of those people is unlimited illegal immigration, because we're not distinguishing between people genuinely fleeing for their lives and people that would just, I could probably get a better job and not have to pay taxes if I illegally cross the border. That's what we're talking about. The vast majority of people that are crossing our borders are not doing it as refugees fleeing for their lives. They're economic migrants moving across and not willing to actually do that the legal way. We have millions of people that have first-generation Americans that did this the legal way. And so I don't think there's any biblical justification for the idea that we have to have open borders and that we have to kind of indiscriminate acceptance of anybody that wants to come here under any circumstances. If you have a country and you want to love it and to preserve it, it is just and right that you preserve that by protecting it and saying, okay, we'd like to have people, but slowly enough that we can assimilate them. And the people we want are the people that can become productive and happy citizens of the United States of America. We want exactly zero people that want to hate and destroy our country. And right now, we're not making any of those distinctions, and those are the kinds of distinctions we have to make. I do think that the majority of the American public agrees with that sentiment, unlike, say, 10 or 12 years ago, where a lot of people didn't realize how existential this threat was.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people today are worried. They know that maybe 7% of the population that wants the government to be bigger. It's interesting how 7 to 10% in all of the polls that we've done, these are really jerks. 7%, they name call, they do all these things. They say, I deal with problems by cutting other people out of my life and things like that. They've got there's been a mental break somewhere, right? But we're so afraid of what those people might say, the names they might call us. Just kind of give us a little bit of courage on that issue.
Yeah. I mean, here's the reality. There's a kind of historical distinction, Jeff, between what's called red martyrdom and white martyrdom. Red martyrdom is where you literally spill your blood for Christ and for the truth. So, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Franciscan priest Maximilian Kolbe, who was murdered in Auschwitz and sacrificed his life for the life of another man who had children. That's red martyrdom. Most of us never experience that or never be asked to experience that. What we will be asked to experience is white martyrdom. And that's the martyrdom in which you lose good feeling, you lose your reputation, you might lose your job, you might lose the prospects for advancement in your job. Those are the kinds of things that I think if we are serious as followers of Christ, we have got to be willing to suffer white martyrdom. Now, that doesn't mean to just be bombastic and imprudent, but it also means that sometimes God will call you to do something that could be harmful to your career or to your reputation for the defense of truth. And I think far too few of us are willing to do that. If 10% more of us even were willing to do that, I think we would not be where we are. The only reason that really, really, really crazy and destructive ideas end up winning the day is that the small minority of advocates can count on the vast majority of normal people not to stand up for it because they know that it will be costly. More of us need to be willing to pay the social and reputational cost to do the right thing and to defend the truth in public. And the more of us that are willing to do that, the fewer of us will have to do it in the long run.
That is a good word. And that's the reason to fight the good fight. And that's the name of your book, Fighting the Good Fight, that you co-wrote with James Robison. Jay, it's always fun to have you on the show. Thank you for coming on and bringing such clarity to issues that are so difficult and confusing for people.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be with you.
Thank you to my guest, Dr. Jay Richards, for coming on the show today. Be sure to check out his latest book, Fight the Good Fight. The subtitle is How an Alliance of Faith and Reason Can Win the Culture War. This podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries. At Summit, we come alongside the rising generation, their trainers, parents, and influencers, so that young adults may know God's truth and become champions of a biblical worldview. If you want to learn more about Summit Ministries or get resources to help the young people in your life embrace and share the truth that changes everything, just visit summit.org. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.